tonight we're heading down cobbled alleyways slick with morning mist, dodging lazy donkeys and vendors who've been shouting since dawn, all in search of something oddly modern for such an ancient setting. A coffee house. Not just any coffee house, though. You're in Istanbul around the year 1550, and this place is buzzing. Though Wi-Fi hasn't been invented and nobody's updating their status. Yet somehow everyone seems to know the latest palace gossip, the price of dates in Damascus, and what scandalous thing the poet Nefi said last night. The doors creak open and you step inside. The smell hits you first. Strong, bitter coffee simmered over ember beds, mingling with thick tobacco smoke and the faint sweetness of rose water. You're surrounded by men lounging on low cushions, slippers off, voices low but intense. One guy is loudly reading a poem that may or may not be about camels. Another is making grand hand gestures that might mean war, or just chess strategy. It's basically Reddit, but with more beards and fewer emojis. And here's the thing. You probably wouldn't survive this world very long. For starters, you'd struggle with the lack of air conditioning, soap, and plausible deniability when you say something politically risky. There are no anonymous usernames here. Say the wrong thing about the Sultan, and next week your regular barista might be the one arresting you. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk farther in, past the warm glow of oil lamps and the low hum of a knee flute in the corner. Someone hands you a tiny porcelain cup without asking what you want. There's only one option. Thick, gritty coffee, likely to coat your teeth in history. You take a cautious sip. It's earthy, smoky, and strong enough to make you blink in slow motion. There's no milk, no sugar, no venti double-shot caramel anything. Just centuries-old simplicity. You ease into the cushions and try to blend in. No one really notices you. That's part of the charm. In Ottoman Istanbul, a coffee house is both public and private. It's where a tailor might sit next to a scholar or a janissary might trade barbs with a poet, but it's also where you can vanish into the soft fog of caffeine and chatter. You're not expected to talk. Just listen, and maybe stare at your cup like it's going to whisper secrets. The rhythm of the place pulls you in. A game of chess here, a heated debate about trade routes there. Someone is drawing elaborate doodles in the margins of a Quran commentary. Another guy is doing nothing at all, just sipping, eyes half closed as if dreaming while awake. Historians still argue whether these early coffee houses were mainly for entertainment or political dissent. Maybe both, maybe neither. Maybe it depends on how good the coffee was that day. But there's no denying the electric stillness of it all. It's quiet, but never boring, and always full. You lean back and listen to a conversation that spirals from local taxes to the latest court poet's scandalous use of metaphor. Did he really compare the Grand Vizier to a melting candlestick? Unclear, but everyone here has an opinion. A cat slinks past your ankles. There's always a cat. Ottoman coffee houses are practically feline embassies. They lounge where they please and nobody moves them. It's part of the vibe. You glance out the window and realize the city outside is equally alive. The mosque down the road has just released its last call to prayer, and a procession of street vendors clatters past, selling grilled fish on skewers and slightly suspicious pastries. But inside the coffee house, time moves differently, slower, more thoughtful, like the space between two sips. Someone lights a fresh brazier and the smell of sandalwood curls into your nostrils. Another customer pulls out a set of wooden beads and starts thumbing them rhythmically, not for prayer, just for habit. The click-clack becomes part of the soundtrack. And here's a fringe fact for you. Some Ottoman coffeehouses even had aquarium walls. Fish tanks, yes, actual fish, built into the structure, shimmering behind the chatter. Were they decorative? Probably. Were they symbolic of depth and clarity in thought? Maybe. Were they just cool? Definitely. You start to notice how easily people slip into roles. The loud talker, the silent observer, the guy who always loses at chess but keeps challenging everyone anyway. These characters repeat in every city, every era. You know them. Maybe you are them. Your cup is almost empty and you're not sure if you've been here for an hour or a lifetime. The room hums, low and intimate, as the night deepens. Outside, the city might be sleeping, but in here, the conversation flows like steam from the next copper pot. You stretch your legs, careful not to trip over the reclining man beside you. He might be asleep or deep in thought. Hard to tell. The line blurs here. This place isn't about coffee, not really. It's about communion, ideas, eavesdropping without judgment. Like any good forum, you can participate or just scroll silently through the chatter. No login required. You swirl the last remnants of coffee in your cup, watching the thick ground settle like a storm passing. One of the regulars sees your empty cup and gives you a knowing look. He snaps his fingers, and without a word, the young boy tending the brazier brings you a fresh one, piping hot. This isn't Starbucks. There's no tip jar. But there is etiquette, and you're quickly learning the rhythms. As you sip again, eyes adjusting to the flickering lamplight, you start to wonder. How did this all begin? How did these little hubs of smoke, gossip, and card games become the heart of Ottoman public life? Well, like many of civilization's best mistakes, it all started with a goat. Or rather, with Kaldi, the possibly mythical Ethiopian goat herd who noticed his flock acting suspiciously jazzed after nibbling on the red berries of a certain bush. Historians still debate whether Kaldi was real or just a convenient folktale, but what matters is the coffee plant, Coffea arabica, is native to Ethiopia, and from there it made a slow but determined journey north. It was the Sufi monks of Yemen who really kicked things off. They discovered that brewing these beans helped them stay awake through long nights of chanting, meditation, and spiritual recitation. Sufi mystics and caffeine, truly the first energy drink influencers. From Yemen, the bean made its way to the port of Mocha. Yes, that's where the name comes from. And then across the Red Sea, Mecca, Cairo, Damascus, and finally Istanbul. The Ottomans, being both incredibly cosmopolitan and a little nosy, caught wind of this potent beverage and thought, interesting, let's make it political. You wouldn't think a drink would need regulation, but coffee wasn't just a liquid, it was a vibe. And like all good vibes, it made the authorities nervous. Still, it slipped in through the cracks. The first documented Ottoman coffeehouse opened in Istanbul around 1555, thanks to two enterprising men from Aleppo. Imagine it. You're a weary merchant, dusty from the road, and suddenly you stumble upon this warm, fragrant indoor oasis where someone hands you a steaming cup of black gold for a few copper coins. Life-changing. These early coffee houses were modest, nothing fancy. Low benches, maybe some rough wall hangings, a few charcoal braziers. But what they lacked in decor, they made up for in buzz. And not just from the caffeine. Within weeks, they became the place to be. Not the mosque, not the market, not even the hammam. The cafés or coffee house was where your average Ottoman Joe or Yusuf went to catch up on current events, share a verse, or hear someone dramatically retell a battle they definitely didn't fight in. You see, in a time when news traveled by mouth and poetry was political, the coffee house became the social search engine. It filtered, ranked, and retold the empire's story, one tiny ceramic cup at a time. And here's a quirky twist. The Ottomans didn't grind their coffee like we do today. They pounded it with a large brass mortar and pestle until it reached a fine, dusty consistency. It was practically pulverized into submission. The result? A thick, sludgy brew that settled in your stomach like a small philosophical stone. But the people couldn't get enough. The aroma alone was enough to lure passers-by off the street, especially when paired with the sound of a ney flute or the faint thump of a shadow puppet stage being set up for the evening. And that sound, it's more important than it seems. Historians still argue whether coffee itself was the real draw or if it was just the excuse for these deeply social, subtly rebellious spaces to exist. Were they just leisure zones? Or were they perhaps a kind of low-level caffeine-fueled resistance? Depends on the decade, and possibly the Sultan's mood. Speaking of moods, yours is mellow now, maybe even cozy, nestled between a wall and a pile of floor cushions that are threatening to swallow you whole. Outside, the call of a muezzin echoes off the Bosphorus and you feel oddly at peace. The coffee house, for all its understated elegance, has done its job. It's made you pause, think, listen. And in an empire where public speech was a delicate dance, that kind of open-air reflection was practically revolutionary. There's a man at the corner table now, unrolling a parchment. He squints through the lantern light and begins reading aloud a letter from his cousin in Aleppo. He's not shy about projecting. His cousin apparently has opinions about grain prices, neighborly disputes, and the governor's habit of wearing overly colorful robes. Everyone listens. Some nod. One guy chuckles and shakes his head. Somehow this becomes a conversation about tulip bulb speculation. Yes, the Ottomans had their own version of crypto exotic flower trading, but that's a story for later. For now, the important thing is this. Coffee didn't just energize the empire, it organized it. It gave people a reason to gather, to share, to argue, and, just as often, to agree. And as you sip again, letting the bitterness coat your tongue like a slow, earthy lullaby, you begin to realize this isn't just a drink, it's infrastructure. It's what kept minds alert while the empire tried to balance faith, conquest, poetry, and trade. Coffee was the glue, and the gossip, and the goad. Outside, the moon has risen. The city hums softer now. But inside the coffee house, the buzz remains, low, steady, and strangely familiar. Like home, your cup grows lighter as your ears grow sharper. You're no longer just watching this Ottoman coffee house. You're part of its quiet choreography. You notice how people come and go without so much as a door creak. How the coal boy always seems to know whose brazier needs a stir. How every cough, shuffle, and murmured verse folds perfectly into the room's soft din. You're sitting in one of the first true coffee houses of Istanbul sometime in the late 16th century. And whether they know it or not, the men around you are participating in a social experiment that will echo down the centuries. Because right now, these 4 plaster walls and a few well-placed cushions are reshaping what public life even means. This coffee house, like many springing up across the city, is simple. It has a wooden frame, perhaps draped with carpets along the lower walls for warmth. Oil lamps hang at careful intervals, their light flickering on the soft sheen of copper trays and worn ceramic cups. Above the door, a hand-painted sign probably has a witty name like the Cup of Wisdom or Bean and Shadow. The Ottomans loved a good pun. The front space is for regulars, the loud ones the social engineers. Further back in the semi-shadow sit the quiet types. Old poets, retired soldiers, that one guy who definitely used to be a spy but now just plays dominoes. And there, nestled between them all, you find the pulse of the empire's newest obsession, the coffee house rhythm. And here's the thing, this wasn't inevitable. Before these spaces popped up, public conversation in Istanbul mostly happened in 2 places: the mosque courtyard and the market. Both were bustling, yes, but neither allowed for lingering. You were supposed to shop or pray and move on, no loitering, no feet-up, soul-searching, joke-cracking hangouts. The coffee house changed that. It invented a 3rd space, not work, not worship, just being. And once it existed, people filled it with whatever they could: games, music, political debate, court gossip, or sometimes just comfortable silence. Historians still argue whether these early coffee houses were modeled on Persian chaikhanas or if they were something completely new. The Persians drank tea, after all. The Ottomans? They took one look at coffee and thought, let's weaponize this into cultural dominance. And it worked. Within a few decades, there were hundreds of coffee houses in Istanbul alone. Some were tiny corner setups with little more than a pot and a bench. Others sprawled across courtyards, complete with hired musicians and traveling poets. You'd know the best ones by the clientele: retired court officials, famous calligraphers, minor princes trying not to look bored. One of the most famous early establishments was called Kivahan, reportedly the first real coffee house in Istanbul. The name roughly translates to vault cafe, which sounds trendy even now. Inside, it hosted debates that occasionally drew the attention of palace informants, and that was part of the thrill. Because here's your fringe tidbit of the night. Some coffee houses actually had a designated storyteller, called a meta. These guys were part stand-up comic, part news anchor, part satirist. One night they might recite a folktale about a fox and a farmer. The next, they'd poke fun at a vizier's extravagant turban choices. People loved it. Authorities, not so much. You notice one of these medas now. A tall, expressive man leaning on a cane he doesn't seem to need. He waits until the room hushes slightly, then launches into a tale about a lovesick pigeon and a greedy landlord. It makes little sense, but somehow the ending brings the room to tears. You're not sure if it's laughter or emotion, but either way, you clap when it ends. Someone behind you mutters a comment about taxes. Another replies with a quip about janissary pensions. Just like that, you've slid into another kind of story, one that shapes perception more than plot. And you realize this place is part comedy club, part town hall, part philosophy seminar. The Ottoman authorities, of course, saw the danger. A crowd of caffeinated citizens with opinions, not ideal for an autocratic state. So coffeehouses were occasionally banned, shut down, or forced to operate in the shadows. Still, they came back, always, like a cat returning to the warmest spot in the room. You're on your third cup now. That tingle behind your eyes might be the caffeine, or it might be the realization that you're experiencing something far bigger than leisure. These people are talking not because they're bored, but because they finally can. One man is reciting part of a court edict, trying to remember it verbatim. Another is scribbling notes for a play he swears will change everything. The old man playing chess hasn't moved his piece in 15 minutes, but you suspect he's thinking about something far older than the game in front of him. And that's the magic of this place. It holds space. It lets time bend a little. You might walk in for a cup of coffee and walk out with a new political philosophy, or at least a decent backgammon strategy. The room is warmer now, both in temperature and tone. Someone passes around dried figs. Another tosses a cloak over the doorway to keep out the midnight chill. You catch a phrase drifting from the far table. And that's why they'll never build the canal. You want to ask which canal, but you let it go. Because here half the fun is not knowing where the conversation will lead. Your coffee now has that muddy end of the cup texture that makes you wonder whether you're supposed to drink it or read your future in it. But you're not quite ready to let go of the warmth. So you cradle the cup, letting the heat seep into your fingers. Around you, the room breathes with a rhythm that feels timeless. Low voices, the scrape of a spoon, a burst of laughter that settles like dust. Then right on cue, you hear it, the soft clink of copper pots from behind the brazier curtain. It's time to dive into the craft itself. Because in the Ottoman Empire, brewing coffee wasn't just a matter of heating water and tossing in grounds. It was practically an art form, passed down with the reverence usually reserved for calligraphy or falconry. The coffee you're drinking was likely brewed in a long-handled pot called a sezve. Made of beaten copper with a graceful little lip, it's designed to sit in a bed of glowing embers, not a flame. No rush, no boiling rage of modern kettles, just slow, deliberate heat, coiling upward through the coffee like a lullaby in liquid form. There's no paper filter, no fancy gadgets. The beans, roasted to a medium darkness with a hint of caramel, have been ground to a fine powder, almost floury, using a brass mortar and pestle. That alone takes serious elbow grease. You imagine someone in the back pounding away while quietly cursing the popularity of caffeine. A spoonful of ground coffee is added to the sezve, followed by cool water and, depending on your tastes, maybe a touch of sugar. Not stirred at first. No, that comes later. The sezve is gently nestled into the glowing embers. Not on top. In. It sinks like a small submarine into red coals, the handle sticking out like a periscope. You wait. You don't stir, you watch. Tiny bubbles begin to form around the edges, not boiling, just whispering. The brew darkens, thickens, and finally a soft foam rises to the surface. That foam is sacred. It's the Ottoman latte art, the crown of the cup. A well-brewed coffee should have a creamy top, not too bubbly, not too flat. Some baristas would rather burn their thumb than let that foam collapse. And here's a detail most modern baristas don't know. In elite circles, serving coffee without a proper K-Mac, that velvety foam, was a mild scandal. There are Ottoman etiquette manuals that go into painful detail about this. Your future, your reputation, maybe even your marriage prospects, could hinge on how well you foamed a cup. Yes, marriage. In fact, here's a quirky tidbit for your sleepy brain. In some parts of the empire, coffee was a crucial part of courtship. A suitor visiting his beloved's family might be served coffee by the girl herself. But if she added salt instead of sugar, well, that was a polite way of saying no thanks. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just one of those delightful exaggerations that coffeehouse storytellers love to sprinkle in. Back in your cafe, the barista glides over with a fresh czezve, pouring the steaming brew into your tiny cup with the precision of a chemist and the flair of a magician. The handle is hot. The aroma is heady. Roasted earth, toasted spice, a whisper of clove that might just be your imagination. The cup is tiny, barely a few sips. But that's the point. Ottoman coffee wasn't meant to be guzzled. It was meant to be savored, discussed, repoured, reinterpreted, like a good poem or a bad political decision. You notice now that everyone drinks it differently. The old man sips slowly, eyes closed, like he's listening to a memory. The gossip circle drinks with one hand, gestures wildly with the other. One young student takes a full 5 minutes between sips as if calculating angles between each mouthful. There's no rush here, no takeout lids, no caffeine countdowns, just copper, coal, and conversation. And while most drink it straight, there are regional flourishes. Some places added cardamom, others a touch of mastic or rose water. In the palaces of the elite, the coffee might arrive on a silver tray accompanied by sherbet, incense, and a napkin folded with military precision. Here in your humble kavahane, you're lucky if someone wipes the lip of the pot. Still, it's perfect. It's everything. It's history in a cup. You take another sip, letting the thick brew sit on your tongue a moment before swallowing. It's not smooth. It's bold, unfiltered, unapologetic. Much like the empire itself. Someone nearby is explaining the different kinds of czezves, how the ones from Damascus are lighter, while the ones from Bursa are better balanced. It's like watching a gearhead talk about engine specs, except their engines make conversation, not horsepower. And then, softly, someone at the far table begins reading a poem. Something about a breeze passing over a jasmine garden at dusk. You don't catch all the words, but the cadence draws you in. The whole room slows, as if waiting for the next line. And it hits you. This isn't just coffee. This is ritual, memory, a medium through which art and politics and heartache flow freely, like water through sand, like steam from a czezve. You set your cup down gently, careful not to disturb the delicate ring of grounds that's formed at the bottom. You know better than to drink it, unless you're planning to get it red. But that's for later. For now, you breathe in the last trace of smoke and cardamom and settle back into the cushions. Your eyes are heavy, your limbs relaxed, your mind gently fizzing from the caffeine. The czezve clinks again in the corner and you smile. Someone's always making another round. You shift your weight just slightly on the cushion. Your legs are starting to tingle, but the kind of tingle that tells you you've been completely still for a while, and your body isn't quite sure if it's resting or listening. Around you, the coffeehouse murmurs on. Someone yawns and someone else drops a playing piece onto a game board with the soft click of bone on wood. Now that you've had your fill of coffee, well, for the moment, you begin to notice your surroundings with a new clarity. It's not just the people that make this place what it is, it's the textures, the furniture, the objects that speak a quiet language of their own. The seating, for one, is low to the ground, broad, flat cushions set on wooden platforms or directly on woven rugs. The kind that give under you just enough to be inviting, but not so much that you'll fall asleep, at least not on purpose. A few patrons nearby are doing their best impressions of decorative pillows, however, snoring gently with arms folded and turbans tilted. Each small group seems to stake out a territory around a central object, either a low three-legged table called a sofa, or a wide brass tray balanced on a stand. This is where the sesve sits, surrounded by tiny cups, sugar dishes, and the occasional plate of dates or figs, depending on how generous the owner is feeling today. You notice one tray bears an inscription, a delicate swirl of Arabic calligraphy that, if your rusty Ottoman is correct, says something like, "To speak is silver, to listen is sweetened." Possibly a proverb, possibly just the cafe's passive-aggressive way of telling people to hush. And then there's the smoke, not the thick blue haze of factory smoke or firewood, but the sweet curling tendrils of nargile, the water pipe. Every few tables, someone leans back with a hose in hand, exhaling slowly through pursed lips as clouds drift ceilingward. The scent is surprisingly soft. Apple, rose, maybe a touch of cinnamon. Not too overpowering. Just enough to soften the edges of conversation. Nargile use in coffeehouses had become increasingly common by the 17th century. While earlier Islamic scholars debated the acceptability of tobacco, with some declaring it downright sinful and others claiming it helped with digestion, the empire gradually adopted a policy of, just don't light it during prayer. Fair enough. You take a glance at a particularly elaborate pipe in the corner. Its glass bowl glows with coal light, and the bubbling sound it makes as someone inhales is oddly soothing, like a kettle underwater. The smoker has a glazed-over look, one slipper off, one eyebrow raised in a thought he's unlikely to share. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some Ottomans believed that where the nargile pipe coiled and how the bubbles rose could affect your mood. A fast bubble pattern, too energetic. Slow and steady, just right. There were even mini manuals written on the etiquette of pipe sharing. Step 1. Don't hog the hose. Beyond the haze, you see decorative items that have no obvious purpose except to create ambiance. A worn tambourine hangs on the wall, perhaps from a past musical night. A cracked porcelain bowl full of dried orange peels sits on a windowsill, scenting the breeze. A brass lamp shaped like a melon leans ever so slightly to one side, giving the whole room a mildly tipsy charm. Someone offers you a blanket. It's threadbare but warm, dyed with pomegranate skin and saffron, smelling faintly of wool and cardamom. You drape it over your legs and sink a little further into the experience. And here's a fun reality check. This coffeehouse probably hasn't been scrubbed in months. Cleanliness standards in the Ottoman world were generally high, especially around baths and mosques. But coffeehouses? Let's say the emphasis was more on atmosphere than antiseptic. That said, the braziers are always swept, the cups rinsed in fresh water, and the cat population keeps the mouse situation well under control. Speaking of which, a sleek black cat just landed gracefully on the windowsill and is now staring at you with open judgment. You nod respectfully, it yawns and turns its back. You let your eyes roam the walls now, noting hand-drawn verses tacked up here and there, scrawled in charcoal or ink. Some are serious, hymns, political commentary, quotes from Sufi mystics. Others are less serious. You spot one that simply reads, "May your coffee be strong, your neighbors dull, and your taxes someone else's problem." Sounds about right. Historians still argue whether coffeehouse decor evolved organically or whether it was influenced by caravanserais, the roadside inns where travelers rested, drank, and exchanged news. It's likely that elements of both worlds combined here. The comfort of shared space, the necessities of brewing gear, and the extra touch of flair that makes people want to come back. Because that's what this is, really. A space for return. No one comes just once. Coffee houses are made to be visited over and over like a favorite book or a well-worn blanket. They're less about novelty and more about familiarity, even ritual. The night deepens. A fresh pot hisses in the background. Someone sneezes, someone else passes a bowl of sugared almonds. You lean back and take it all in. The wood, the smoke, the cushions, the cups, the quiet. It's a kind of architecture built not of bricks but of comfort, the furniture of fellowship, the upholstery of empire, and as your eyes begin to drift again toward the glinting copper of a freshly polished sesve, you realize something else. This entire room, from floor to rafters, is a kind of soft machinery. It works not on steam or gears, but on routine, on presence, on the clink of a spoon, on knowing that the blanket you were just handed has warmed a dozen knees before yours. A gentle rustle draws your attention. A breeze slips in through a latticed window, stirring the lamp flames just enough to cast dancing shadows across the floor. The murmurs haven't stopped, but they've taken on a more conspiratorial tone now, like everyone speaking with one eye on the door. You're starting to understand why. Ottoman coffeehouses may be havens of comfort and routine, but they're also where conversation tends to escalate fast. You can be casually comparing the flavor of two melon vendors one moment and knee-deep in political theory the next. All it takes is one spark, a sly joke about the vizier's new coat, a rumor about a tax hike, a poem with suspiciously modern metaphors, and suddenly you're in the deep end. You sip your coffee slower this time, not just because it's hotter, but because the table next to yours has just brought up the Sultan. Loudly, bold move. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan wasn't just a political figure. He was the caliph, the shadow of God on earth. Publicly criticizing him was about as welcome as setting fire to your tax records in front of a clerk. Yet somehow, coffee houses became the one place where people dared to push the envelope. Not in big, sweeping declarations, no, this was subtler. Satire, wordplay, the occasional anonymous poem recited with just enough inflection to make clear who the villain really was. You start to notice how every statement is wrapped in layers. An innocent tale about a crooked merchant becomes a jab at the treasury. A puppet play about a bickering couple turns into a riff on government inefficiency. Historians still argue whether the coffeehouse really posed a threat to imperial power or whether the state simply felt threatened. What's undeniable is that they noticed, and they didn't love it. More than once, edicts were issued forbidding political discussion in coffee houses. Enforcement, however, proved tricky. What counted as political? A joke? A rumor? A shadow puppet who bore a strange resemblance to a certain unpopular tax official? This slipperiness gave coffee houses an electric charge. You could talk about anything as long as you were clever. You listen now as a man with a thick mustache spins a tale about a caravan that loses its way due to too many map makers. Everyone chuckles. You chuckle too. Only later do you realize he was talking about palace advisors. There's a tension in the room, but it's a good one. It crackles quietly under the laughter like a fire that's been banked just enough to keep from roaring. The fact that people feel free to say almost anything here makes it more valuable than gold. Because while the mosque might feed your soul and the market your belly, the coffee house feeds your mind. You look over at the chessboard. One of the pieces, a pawn perhaps, has been carved to look suspiciously like a janissary. The Ottoman military elite had, by this point, become as much a political institution as a martial one. Someone set it diagonally on the edge of the board, like it's half in play and half in exile. That might be a joke, or a warning. It was, after all, in places like this that revolutions began to hum. Not explode, just hum. Quietly, relentlessly. Think of it as slow-cooked dissent seasoned with cloves. A man beside you leans over and whispers, "Did you hear what happened in Bursa?" His eyes dart left, then right. You haven't, but you nod anyway. That's the rule. You always nod. Then listen. Then file it away, safe behind your forehead for later. Because in this world, news travels faster through whispers than decrees. Here's your fringe detail. Some coffee houses employed unofficial listeners known as kulak, literally ears. They were paid or sometimes coerced to eavesdrop and report back to local officials or even palace scribes. The irony, of course, is that their presence only made the conversations more layered. Everyone assumed they were being overheard, so the real messages were buried in metaphors, callbacks, and sarcasm so dry it might qualify as desert terrain. And yet people kept talking. They still do. Because talking is relief. It's resistance. And sometimes it's just funny. The storyteller in the corner clears his throat and begins a new tale. This one about a bureaucrat who can't find his turban because his assistant keeps stealing them for use as wine strainers. The crowd howls. Is this about inefficiency? Mismanagement? The Grand Vizier's actual turban scandal of 1642? Who knows? You laugh too, safe in the cloud of ambiguity. Across the room, the nargile bubbles again. A man finishes his cup, flips it over onto the saucer, and waits. A woman, the fortune teller, glides over from the shadows to read the patterns. She peers into the inky trails like a scholar examining a coded manuscript. "Ah," she says half to herself, "I see. A fish." Everyone leans in. You lean in too. A fish trapped in a jar, but the jar is open. The audience exchanges meaningful glances. Is this about someone in exile? A returning ally? Someone plotting a comeback? You don't need to know, you just need to be here in the room to feel the tremors under the surface. Outside, the wind rattles a shutter, the lamps flicker again. You tug the blanket tighter and feel oddly protected. Not because this place is safe, but because it's aware. Everyone here knows the rules and how to bend them just enough to keep the conversation flowing. This, you realize, is a community not of agreement, but of engagement. People disagree, passionately. But they keep coming back night after night to the same low tables, the same battered trays, the same well-worn debates. And you're now one of them. You sip your coffee, nod thoughtfully, and wait for the next spark. The door creaks again, this time admitting a swirl of night air and a new guest. He's older, his robes dusted with travel, and he greets the brazier boy like an old friend before folding into a corner cushion with the ease of a man who's been here 1,000 times. No fanfare, no introduction, just one of the cast returning to his usual scene. Because if there's one thing Ottoman coffee houses offered in abundance, it was characters. Not the over-the-top theatrical type, though you definitely find a few of those. No, these were the steady, wonderfully odd regulars that brought the whole operation to life, and tonight you start to meet them in earnest. Your first encounter? The meta or storyteller already in mid-tale. You've seen him before, but now you're watching closely. He's changed hats. Literally. A different turban today, looser, perhaps signaling a comic tone. He leans into the candlelight, gesturing with exaggerated elegance as he recounts the tale of a clumsy scribe who accidentally declares war on himself. The audience is riveted. You suspect the story might contain hidden commentary on last week's tax reforms. When he finishes, applause, soft but sincere. He nods, accepts a fresh cup of coffee like a payment in kind, and melts back into the shadows. His voice will linger, though. People here have long memories for a well-told joke. Next to him sits the amekli janissaries, the retired janissary. He's missing 2 teeth and has an enviably bushy mustache, which he strokes like a thinking tool. He doesn't say much unless the topic involves military logistics, in which case he'll suddenly launch into a detailed critique of bridge placement in campaigns from decades past. You can't tell if he's right or just really confident. Then there's the student, always scribbling, always underdressed, usually with ink on at least one knuckle and a brow furrowed deeply enough to suggest either profound thought or mild indigestion. He listens more than he speaks, though every now and then he blurts out a line of poetry with the urgency of someone trying to remember a dream. At the next table, the Salak, the eager novice, has overcooked his coffee again. His sesve boils furiously before he can grab it from the coals, and now he's frantically scraping foam off the sides of the cup in a doomed effort to save face. The regulars watch with benign amusement. One offers him a date. It's both comfort and a hint. The corner cushion belongs to the Gulgachi, the shadow puppeteer. He doesn't talk much, but he's brought his puppet box tonight. You notice the faded paint on the figures. Karagöz with his red cap and bulbous nose, Hatzivat with his clever eyebrows and knowing smirk. The Gulgachi will likely put on a performance later, and everyone knows it. Until then, he sips quietly, eyes scanning the room for story fodder. And then there's your favorite, the Dedikoduku, the gossiper. No official title, no puppet stage, just a well-trained voice that somehow always lands right next to the juiciest part of a conversation. She, yes, tonight's version is a woman in a charcoal shawl, rarely shares anything that starts as a secret, but somehow everything she says becomes one. Historians still argue whether these characters emerged naturally or whether coffeehouse culture created the roles itself, like a theater that casts its own play night after night. The truth is probably both. When people gather regularly, personalities rise, habits solidify, and slowly a room becomes more than a room. It becomes a living organism with familiar organs. You realize, too, that not everyone here is a performer. Some are observers. Quiet men in scholars' robes who nod periodically. Merchants calculating things silently in their heads. Travelers like the man who just walked in, now recounting camel rates from Baghdad and prices of saffron in Bursa. His audience hangs on every word. A fringe detail floats to mind. In some coffee houses, you could hire someone to sit and just listen. Not advise, not talk. Just sit, sip, nod. A human comment section. Therapy Ottoman style. You lean back and marvel at the balance. There's no script, but there's structure. No set list, but rhythms emerge. The gossip leads into the poetry leads into the puppetry. The puppetry unearths a political joke. Someone counters with a proverb. The janissary grunts his disapproval. And round it goes. You think of modern forums, of how comment threads twist and coil. It's not so different. Except here, nobody's anonymous. Every comment carries the weight of breath, tone, and the undeniable intimacy of shared air. A fresh round of coffee arrives, its aroma sharper this time. Someone has added cardamom. You smile. It's the same old play with a slight new costume. As the storyteller prepares to rise again, you realize that coffee houses weren't just proto-internet spaces. They were also communal archives. Each visitor brought not only their words, but their presence. Their laughter, their silences, their slippered feet and sleepless eyes. And you're now part of the cast too. Whether you speak or not, your listening fills a role. So you tuck your legs under the blanket, cradle the warm cup in your palms, and prepare to hear what happens next in the long, winding story that lives in this room. A story told one cup, one voice, one nod at a time. You're halfway through your fourth cup now, maybe fifth. Who's counting? And your body is calm but alert, like it knows you're still in the middle of something. Conversations around you drift between whispers and chuckles, and the puppeteer has begun setting up his tiny shadow theater against a linen screen stretched between two pillars. A candle is already flickering behind it. You might get a performance tonight. But first, a curious hush moves through the room. Not silence exactly, but a kind of collective stilling, as though everyone just remembered something at the same time. Or maybe just someone. You glance toward the door. It hasn't opened. Then you hear it. The clipped sound of footsteps outside, not sandals, boots. The kind polished by someone who doesn't pour his own coffee. The atmosphere doesn't shift into panic, just something more practiced. Composure. Mugs are quietly set down. Conversations change gears. That lively debate about the Grand Vizier's nose becomes very suddenly a discussion about melon varietals in summer. You don't even see who enters, but you can tell by the posture of those near the doorway that a bekçi, a city guard, or worse, a palace informant, has just stepped in to observe, or inquire, or as everyone likes to say, enjoy the coffee. Because while these places are freewheeling hubs of wit and philosophy, there's a long and tangled history of what wasn't allowed inside. And it's more complicated than just, don't insult the Sultan. You sip carefully and notice the subtle cues. A man rolls up a chessboard, another tucks a half-finished poem into his sash. It's not fear, it's etiquette. An unspoken understanding that some topics, some activities, and yes, some guests require a temporary change of mask. Historically, Ottoman authorities attempted to regulate coffeehouses in dozens of ways. The most predictable bans were on alcohol and gambling. Drinking, especially hard liquor, was never part of the Ottoman coffeehouse vibe. It belonged to other, less reputable establishments. But gambling? That was tricky. Backgammon and card games were hugely popular. Some coffeehouses even hosted tournaments. But when things got too rowdy, or debts were too loudly discussed, edicts were issued. One 17th century firman explicitly outlawed all games involving dice, cards, or wagering, regardless of who wins or loses. Naturally, people responded by renaming the games. This isn't gambling, it's skillful bean arrangement. Then there were the more eccentric bans. In some regions, musical instruments were prohibited, particularly the deaf tambourine, which was deemed disruptive to good order and distracting from conversation. You imagine the tambourine smugly clinking in protest somewhere out of earshot. Here's your fringe tidbit. In one case, authorities actually banned the use of metal spoons in coffee houses. Why? Not for safety, though yes, they could be used in fights, but because the clinking was deemed too noisy. Wooden spoons only, if you please. You eye the small tray on your table. All wood. Rule followed. Historians still argue whether these bans were enforced evenly or simply used as excuses to punish undesirable gatherings. A group of loyal merchants chatting about grain? Probably safe. A circle of sharp-tongued poets discussing court taxes? Less so. And what about women? That's more complicated. Most coffee houses were male only, not by imperial law, but by cultural norm. The phrase public sphere meant male sphere, and even as the empire grew more diverse, the coffeehouse remained mostly a men's retreat. That said, there were exceptions. In larger cities like Istanbul, you'd find a few women-run coffee stalls, sometimes near markets or ferry piers, and elite women of the palace. They had their own salons, less smoky, more perfumed, but no less full of conversation and poetry. Back here in your current cafe, the puppeteer has paused his setup. The guard, or whoever it is, hasn't made a scene. He sips politely, says nothing, and studies the room like a man waiting to be noticed. Everyone obliges him by not noticing. Then someone sneezes. A chain reaction of blessings follows. Çok yaşa, sen de gör, hep beraber. 3 languages, 2 cultures, 1 shared custom. The tension breaks and the puppeteer starts his play after all. You watch the first silhouettes dance across the screen. Karagöz trips over a basket. Hatsivat scolds him. Someone makes a joke about sewer taxes. The room erupts in laughter. The guard chuckles too. A beat late, but close enough. There are no weapons allowed in here, no arguments loud enough to attract real notice, no speeches, no open sedition. But still, the ideas slip through. Like smoke, like steam, like a well-timed puppet joke that means 2 things at once. You wonder now about the unwritten rules. The way everyone seems to know how far is too far. It's not fear, it's finesse. Like walking across a frozen lake with just enough pressure to hear it creak, but not enough to fall through. The visitor finally stands, nods, leaves, and the exhale that follows isn't loud, but it's collective. Someone jokes, "He didn't even finish his coffee." Another replies, "Probably doesn't know how to foam it." Laughter swells again. The game board is returned to the table. Someone takes out a stringed instrument, quietly, discreetly, and plucks a gentle rhythm, almost like a heartbeat returning to normal. You let your shoulders relax. The room feels lighter again, like it knows it passed another test. These little brushes with surveillance aren't rare, but they've become part of the rhythm, part of the ritual. You speak freely, but never foolishly. You joke honestly, but always with layers. It's the Ottoman version of encryption. And as the shadow play continues and the laughter swirls up with the scent of coffee and pipe smoke, you feel the hum return. That low, steady buzz of people speaking just enough truth to be heard, and just enough care to not be silenced. A deep stretch pulls at your spine as you shift on the cushion, your limbs now settled into the slower tempo of the night. The puppeteer has packed away his shadow box. The storyteller is nodding off in his corner. The conversations hum again, gentler now, like the low murmuring of water in a basin. And yet beneath all this soft routine, you sense something peculiar in the air, something electric. That peculiar something is danger. Because here's a little-known historical fact. Coffee, this cozy, comforting, quietly steamy drink, was, at several points in Ottoman history, a crime. Or at least, drinking it was. And you, dear listener, are now a full-blown criminal in 3 sips or less. You probably won't survive this one either. Not if Sultan Murad IV catches you. Let's rewind. Murad IV ruled in the early 1600s, a time of political anxiety, administrative chaos, and growing unrest. The empire was cracking at the edges, and Murad, fierce, paranoid, and possibly fueled by his own haunted dreams, believed he could fix things with, among other things, strict public morality, which meant no alcohol, no tobacco, and famously, no coffee. Yes, the very drink being passed around your sleepy circle like a sacrament was once considered a threat to state stability. And not just frowned upon, banned violently and without loopholes. Historians still argue whether Murad's crackdown was a genuine moral crusade or a thinly disguised attempt to suppress the growing political chatter in coffee houses. Likely both. His edicts didn't mince words. He sent out soldiers, spies, and secret police. Not just to shut down cafés, but to beat, imprison, or even execute repeat offenders. Here's your fringe detail. Legend has it that Murad would occasionally disguise himself and roam the streets at night, checking for violators. If he caught someone sipping a forbidden cup in the dark, that was it. No trial, just judgment. You glance at your coffee and give it a respectful nod. Naturally, this made the drink even more desirable. What's banned becomes bold, and what's bold becomes symbolic. Drinking coffee under Murad became an act of quiet rebellion. It wasn't just about staying awake, it was about being aware, being present, being willing to listen, think, and question things out loud. And of course, Ottomans being Ottomans, they got creative. Some coffee houses moved underground, literally. Others paid off local guards. Some brewed tea in front and coffee in back. One enterprising cafe reportedly built false walls and sliding panels to hide kettles and sesvis. If a guard arrived, the coffee was hidden and a tray of raisins was immediately produced. Raisins. No one was banning those. You can't help but smile at the stubborn ingenuity. Eventually, after Murad's death, the bans softened, but they never fully disappeared. Every few decades, some new official would try to crack down on coffee houses, claiming they were dens of vice, idleness, or seditious chatter. And every time the crackdown failed. The people loved their coffee too much, not just the drink, but the space it created. A place to gather, to speak, to listen, to feel the quiet dignity of being part of something larger than yourself. You sip your own coffee now, and it tastes a little stronger with that knowledge. You glance around the room, suddenly aware of all the little signals of resistance. The old man nodding slowly as a younger poet talks about shifting winds. The pipe smoker tapping his foot just off beat, like he's signaling in Morse. The chess game where the pawns have started moving like courtiers in a palace drama. It's all theater. But it's also truth. There's a joke someone whispers near you about the Grand Vizier and his failed beard-growing attempts. It's barely audible, but the table erupts into soft laughter. You laugh too. Then you wonder, is that joke real? Was it based on anything? Or was it just a test? A spark sent into the room to see who catches fire? You don't know. You don't care. You sip again. Here's the thing. Repression doesn't silence people. It just teaches them how to speak in symbols. Coffeehouses were where the Ottoman Empire learned to read between the lines, to see the poetry in complaint and the protest in a proverb. The walls around you are smooth stone, warmed by the embers in the brazier. One of the lamps flickers, casting a long shadow over a faded inscription painted near the door. It's in Persian, but someone translates it for you. The tongue of the wise is in their heart. The heart of the fool is on their tongue. A message, a warning, maybe just a reminder to think before speaking, especially when coffee becomes contraband. Someone starts humming in the back of the room. It's not a song you recognize, but it's slow, sad, and carries the strange sweetness of defiance. A lullaby for the awake. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over you. You can still feel the cup's warmth, the scent of char and cardamom, the hum of voices barely touching the edge of sleep. This coffee house, for all its quiet charm, has lived through censorship, raids, royal edicts, and whispered threats. And yet here it is, tonight, alive and murmuring in your ear. All because a few people long ago decided that conversation mattered more than comfort. That it was worth the risk to sit down with friends or strangers and tell the truth, even if it had to come dressed in metaphor and foam. So you take one more sip. Not because you're thirsty, but because you can. The hush after the guard's visit has long since melted into a mellow rhythm. The puppeteer's gone home. The chessboard's packed away, and someone is plucking gently at a saz, its notes fluttering like dust through sunbeams. You lean back, the cushion embracing your spine, and watch the room ease into its most magical phase. Not loud, not silent, but somewhere dreamily in between. This is when the real storytelling begins. No stage, no props, just words, spoken slow and low by whoever has the voice tonight. Sometimes it's the meta, sometimes the old merchant, sometimes the gossiper who suddenly reveals a poetic side no one expected. Tonight it's a man in a patched vest who begins, without preamble, to recite a poem about a river that refuses to stop whispering. Everyone listens, because in Ottoman coffeehouses, storytelling wasn't a bonus feature. It was part of the infrastructure. These weren't just hangouts. They were venues of performance, information, satire, and song. And at the center of that web sat a vibrant theatrical tradition built around public speech. You already know about the shadow plays. But tonight you're experiencing the oral press, a swirl of puppets, poetry, and public opinion that kept the Ottoman citizen, however humble, alert to the shifting winds of their world. The storyteller moves from poem to fable. Now it's about a sleepy lion and a mischievous goose. But wait, Everyone knows the lion is the sultan and the goose, probably the court poet Nefi, known for stirring up more than a few royal tempers. The crowd chuckles knowingly. Historians still argue whether these layered tales ever actually influenced policy or just helped people cope with it. But one thing is certain. The coffee house was where ideas were softened into symbols. Funny, strange, ironic symbols that could pass through the tight weave of censorship like mist. You sip again, and a man near you leans in to share a rumor. The rumor is told like a riddle. The riddle turns into a joke. The joke includes a line of verse that echoes the poem you just heard. And suddenly you realize everything is connected. A single thread of thought weaving its way through cups and couches. Here's your fringe tidbit. Some metas were so popular that their audiences would follow them from coffee house to coffee house like fans chasing a concert tour. They had signature tales, dramatic pauses that would silence an entire room, and punchlines so well loved that people would mouth along like they were singing a favorite line in a lullaby. You glance at the wall where someone has chalked out a verse, slanted, hurried script. Speak softly, for truth is a visitor who prefers not to be seen. It's not signed. It doesn't need to be. You notice now that storytelling isn't limited to the performers. Even casual conversation takes on a rhythm, a dramatic structure. Someone starts a sentence with, "So there I was in Edirne," and the room listens with theatrical expectation. The act of telling becomes elevated, stylized, tender. And because coffee houses were mostly illiterate spaces, these oral traditions were more than entertainment. They were memory itself. The room remembers things that books forget. Names, nicknames, scandals, births. A strange dream someone once had that predicted a fire 2 days before it happened. And then, the news. Not in headlines, but in laughter. A new puppet tale begins. A short skit improvised with 2 scraps of leather on sticks. Karagos accidentally gives away the janissaries' entire salary to a beggar disguised as a tax official. The punchline involves a chicken and a misquoted hadith. The room wheezes with delight. You laugh too, though you're not entirely sure why. The joke is layered, culturally coded, maybe even time-sensitive to this exact week in Ottoman politics, but still it lands. Because laughter has its own kind of fluency. Across from you, someone starts drawing with a bit of charcoal on a plate. An impromptu cartoon. A donkey in a judge's turban. It's wiped clean with a fig leaf before the plate ever leaves the table. You begin to see the coffee house not just as a location, but as a publishing house. A think tank. A live feed. And the people here, they're content creators with excellent comedic timing and highly trained sarcasm. There's a phrase someone uses when retelling the day's events. As we all knew yesterday, though no one said it aloud. It gets a laugh. It also tells you everything you need to know about how news works here. One man begins humming again. No words, just a low tune that drifts into the cracks of conversation like soft wind through reeds. Someone else picks it up and suddenly the melody has context. A love story, perhaps. Or a memory. Historians tell us that coffee houses were the birthplace of a uniquely Ottoman public opinion. Not shouted in the streets, not declared on parchment, but passed hand to hand like a cup of hot, strong brew. The Sultan had his spies, but the people had this. The teller finishes another story. A woman with a wide shawl claps gently. Someone coughs, signaling the end of that chapter. And still no one leaves. The stories have done their job. They've kept the soul warm, the mind sharp, and the night beautifully blurry. You sip what's left of your coffee, barely a mouthful now, thick with grounds, and watch as another story begins. No introduction, no title, just a voice, a pause, and a room ready to listen. The stories fade. The music softens and the lamps are trimmed just enough to let the corners slip into a velvet kind of darkness. The room shifts again. Not louder, not quieter, but inward. A handful of men close their eyes, not asleep, but drifting in that delicious halfway place between thought and dreaming. You stretch gently, the blanket falling into your lap like a pet cat, and begin to notice something odd about the rhythm of the place. There's a pattern to the movement. Who comes in, who goes out, who stays, but something is conspicuously absent. You realize now that through all your time here, you haven't seen a single woman walk through the door. Not once. Not even to deliver a tray or collect a coin. And yet just outside, past the wooden shutters and the flickering glow of the brazier, the city breathes with both halves of its population. So where are the women? This, dear listener, is one of the more subtle paradoxes of the Ottoman coffeehouse. Inside it hums with debate, with laughter, with news. But it is overwhelmingly a male space. Not by imperial decree, there's no official law against women entering, but by custom, comfort, and the slow architecture of gendered space that settles like dust on old cushions. In Ottoman society, women had their own domains, private homes, bathhouses, gardens, and in elite circles, literary salons. They weren't silent, they weren't invisible, but they were elsewhere. Still, women weren't excluded from coffee culture entirely. In fact, here's a fringe detail. Some women owned and operated small coffee stalls, especially near markets, ferry docks, and caravanserais. Their customers were often other women or lower-income men too busy for the sit-down experience of a full coffee house. These stalls were quick, efficient, and essential to the social rhythms of the city. Some even served sweets alongside their coffee, candied quince, syrup-soaked dates, pistachio rolls. No smoke, no chess, no puppets, just a cup, a treat, and a moment of calm. Historians still argue whether these small stalls count as coffee houses or something else entirely. But whatever label we apply, they mattered. They fed the same need, to gather, to pause, to share a thought over something warm. And in wealthier households, elite women had indoor salons where coffee was served with elaborate ceremony. Think silver trays, embroidered napkins, and porcelain cups so delicate they felt like eggshells in your hand. The conversation here wasn't about puppet plays or taxes, but poetry, politics, and palace gossip whispered behind painted fans. These salons were private, yes, but powerful. Influential women, consorts, mothers of sultans, educated daughters of high officials, often played significant roles in shaping opinion, advising their male relatives, even swaying court appointments. You might not see them in the coffee house, but their presence lingers in the stories being told. A sharp line of verse about a too powerful vizier might have originated in a harem chamber. A whispered rumor about a new tax perhaps passed from handmaid to baker to merchant before it reached this room. There are even tales, half legend, half truth, of veiled women sneaking into coffee houses in disguise. Some came to listen, a few came to perform. One famous meta in Bursa was rumored to be a woman who impersonated a man for years. her voice so compelling that no one dared question it. You look again at the room around you. It's easy to imagine that every word spoken here has passed through unseen hands, that every joke, every jab, every half-poem has already been softened, tested, and whispered by someone you'll never see. And here's another reality check. The absence of women in this coffee house doesn't mean absence from history. It means adaptation. While men built their coffee culture in public, women shaped theirs in parallel, quiet, elegant, and deeply influential. You glance down at your cup and think of a mother teaching her daughter how to brew it just right, how to time the foam, how to read the grounds not just for fortune but for tone, for who might be coming, for what mood they'll carry, for how best to soften the conversation. The gendered boundaries of the Ottoman world weren't immovable walls. They were more like veils, opaque but shifting. And behind every story in this room you start to sense another one, spoken in quieter spaces with equal sharpness and perhaps a touch more sugar. Someone taps your foot by accident. He nods in apology and slides a little closer to the brazier. The room is more crowded now than before, the edges of the evening folding in. A few patrons are discussing a recent poem written by a woman in Salonika. They debate the second verse. One of them recites it, careful to pronounce the long vowels just right. You realize even here, behind walls that lean heavily toward the masculine, the voices of women echo. Subtle, indirect, unmistakable. And so you take another sip, not out of habit, but out of respect. Outside, the wind picks up. A shutter claps. The street beyond the coffee house seems quieter, less alive. But inside, the room swells with conversation, with questions, with warmth. And somewhere in the rhythm of all that, you hear her voice too. The air has thickened into the comforting kind of night. A mix of ember glow, pipe smoke, and words so slow they feel like they're floating. You're not sleepy exactly, just wonderfully detached from time, as if the hour can no longer reach you. Somewhere behind you, someone begins explaining why goats are better weather predictors than astrologers. Across the room, a student laughs too hard at something whispered only to him. You notice now the corner table is fuller than it was earlier. That's where the scholars gather. Quiet, a little aloof, but always listening. And not just the kind of scholars who read ancient texts for fun. Though yes, at least one of them definitely does that. These are mathematicians, calligraphers, philosophers, astronomers, geographers, people who understand things about orbits and ink recipes and the metaphysics of beard grooming. And they've chosen the coffee house over their desks tonight. Because here's something most people forget. Coffee houses weren't just social clubs, they were academic habitats. A place to think out loud, to test a theory, to casually mention, I'm working on a translation of Euclid between sips. And unlike the formal madrasas or Islamic schools, these places didn't require credentials, only curiosity. You lean closer, pretending to stretch and catch part of a conversation. But if Mars is visible in the eastern sky, it may coincide with the grain barge delay. Again. Someone nods slowly. Another mutters, "Of course," as in Galen's commentary on air currents. No one laughs. They're being entirely serious. Historians still argue whether these conversations ever led to formal discoveries. Probably not in the sense of eureka moments, but coffee houses helped ideas mature. They were the compost heaps of intellectual life. messy, lively, and strangely fertile. And here's your quirky tidbit. One Ottoman scholar wrote an entire treatise on the boiling point of water, inspired entirely by watching coffee brew over different embers in various cafés. His conclusion? The flame tells the truth before the cup does. Science with a side of espresso. In these places, logic and caffeine held hands. You could argue about Avicenna's theories while also ranking the best eggplants at the market. It was equal parts enlightenment and neighborhood gossip hour. The man across from you is doodling geometric shapes in spilled coffee with the tip of a spoon. You're almost sure that's a dodecagon forming until he blows it gently and starts again. There's something comforting in how these great minds blend into the crowd. No one's on a pedestal. A philosopher might be interrupted mid-theory by the brazier boy asking if he wants more foam next time. An astrologer might lose his train of thought trying to explain retrograde motion over the sound of someone winning a game of dominoes. You glance toward the door where a group of scribes is just arriving. Ink-stained sleeves, scrolls under arms. They look like they came straight from a copying room. One of them says, "Finally, my brain's been dry since noon." The implication is clear, the coffee house is the well. You might think this would be a distraction for serious thinkers, but quite the opposite. Ottoman scholars, especially those interested in ILM knowledge, believed wisdom was best shared in company, over time, and with refreshment. A lonely idea like a dry tongue doesn't travel far, so the coffee house became their forum. Tonight's main topic seems to be astrology versus astronomy. A man with a milky eye and a constellation tattooed on his hand is explaining how different imams interpret Saturn's movement. Someone challenges him gently, citing a Persian text no one else has read. A debate unfolds, fluid, respectful, drifting into numerology and back out into actual math. No one's yelling. No one's scribbling furious notes. They're just exchanging. You realize the atmosphere matters, the low seats, the warm lighting, the way you're always slightly reclined. It keeps everything just casual enough to discourage pretension, but just serious enough to keep you alert. It's a space where questions are welcome, but only if you're willing to stir them slowly. You ask one yourself, something simple, about how Ottoman map makers decided where to place Mecca on a globe. The man next to you grins and says, "Ah, the Qibla problem. You'd best talk to Yusuf, the cartographer. He's partial to ink-stained proofs." He points across the room. You recognize Yusuf. He's been playing chess all night. Turns out the game board was a grid of star charts. Here's another fringe fact. Some coffee houses had astronomy nights. Not formally scheduled, just spontaneous skyward thinking when the stars were especially bright. People would bring small astrolabes or sketch moon phases into the soot near the hearth. Someone might recite a poem about Venus. Someone else might start comparing eclipses to government reform. Because, of course, everything was political if you looked hard enough. You finish your cup again. Or at least you think it's your cup. There are now 3 identical ones on your tray, all partially filled, none clearly yours. You sip from one, it's warm. Possibly yours. Possibly someone else's with better sugar. You don't mind. That's part of the exchange, too. Now the discussion is shifted. Someone's brought up ink recipes, how blue fades faster than red unless mixed with crushed lapis or indigo bark. A debate begins over the best paper for copying Quranic verses. It's not just theoretical. One man pulls out a tiny folded page and passes it around. Everyone examines it like an artifact. You hold it in your fingers. It's thick, handmade. The calligraphy dances. Someone says that took 3 weeks. You believe him. You hand it back and your fingers carry the faint smell of rosewater and ash. The conversation will continue long after you leave. The cup you held might be filled again by someone else tomorrow night, who will hear something you didn't, add a verse of their own, and pass the thought along like a handwritten letter in the shape of steam. And as the scholars lean in again, talking now about the geometry of mosque domes and whether numbers themselves have divine intention, you settle back against your cushion and smile. You're not here to solve anything, just to steep in it. The scholars have slipped into a comfortable buzz of metaphysics now. Soothing, lyrical, and a little dizzying, like philosophical white noise. You let their words drift past you like steam from a cooling cup, your attention gently drifting to another corner of the coffee house, where a game of tavla, backgammon, is just heating up. One of the players, an apricot seller by day and apparent backgammon shark by night, slams a piece into place with exaggerated flair. His opponent groans dramatically, muttering something about bad omens and unlucky dice, though no dice were involved. They both burst into laughter, and a round of onlookers groans in sympathy. You scoot your cushion a little closer, time to explore another essential slice of Ottoman coffeehouse life. How they pass the time. Because once the coffee was poured and the smoke started curling, these places became incubators of every kind of idle brilliance. Some patrons came to debate or read, others to simply play. And there were so many ways to play. Backgammon was the undisputed champion of Ottoman table games. The rhythmic clatter of pieces, the muttered prayers before risky moves, the feigned outrage after a loss. It all made for a kind of theater. There was etiquette, of course. Beginners played quietly, masters never. Serious players brought their own boards, often carved with intricate calligraphy or geometric patterns, and a truly stylish set of pieces could command as much admiration as a fine robe. You try your hand, encouraged by the baker across the board from you. He grins like a man who smelled your fear and still handed you the dice. You roll, a double 6. A chorus of ooh rises behind you, beginner's luck or beginner's curse. The game unfolds. You're not good, but your mistakes are met with good-natured teasing. Someone offers you a honey-soaked fig as consolation. You eat it slowly, pretending it helps your strategy. Nearby, a group of men pass around a well-thumbed falname, a fortune-telling book. It's worn at the corners, the spine held together with string, but its pages are filled with symbols, verses, and cryptic illustrations. One man flips it open randomly and reads aloud, "You will soon meet a stranger. He will offer advice. Do not follow it." Everyone laughs. One of them gestures to you. See, the book knows. Historians still debate the seriousness of Ottoman fortune-telling customs. Were they sacred, silly, something in between? Coffee ground reading, cafés, was especially popular. After finishing their cup, patrons would swirl the dregs, flip the cup over onto the saucer, and wait. When the ground settled, someone, often a self-appointed mystic with good eyesight and a flair for metaphor, would read the patterns. You try it now. Your cup's been finished for a while, and the fortune teller from earlier is back at her seat, fanning herself lazily with a folded page of poetry. She takes your cup, squints, tilts it, frowns slightly. "Ah," she says, "a fish again." The room chuckles. "Still trapped?" someone asks. "No," she says, tapping the saucer. "But now it's hiding behind a spoon." Cryptic, likely nonsense, but strangely satisfying. You realize then that these games and fortunes aren't just diversions. They're rituals, reassurances, little ceremonies of chance that make life feel manageable. In a city that churns with unpredictability, sometimes a double six or a squiggly fish in your cup is enough to spark joy. Someone brings out a deck of his Nas cards, Persian in origin, older than modern playing cards. The faces are faded, painted in delicate inks. They're used for storytelling, not betting. One card shows a scribe, another a king, another a lion pacing in a cage. The players invent a story, card by card, embellishing it together. The rules are fluid, the results are ridiculous. Your favorite moment? The lion turns out to be a vegetarian. And then there are the talk games. Bill Messe, the riddles. One man stands and asks, "What has a face and no mouth, a hand and no fingers, and tells truth without words?" You don't need long. It's a clock. But someone shouts, "My cousin's second wife," and the table erupts into laughter again. The hours stretch, not because time slows, but because you forget to measure it. Everything here is looped into rhythm. A cup, a story, a game, a joke, a refill. You lose a round, win a riddle, drop a piece into the ashtray, and no one minds. There's no score. The purpose isn't to finish anything, it's to stay in motion softly. Here's your fringe fact. Some coffee houses even hosted competitive storytelling duels. Two speakers would be given a topic, why birds envy clouds, for example, and each would have 3 minutes to spin a tale. The audience chose the winner, usually by applause or by throwing a dried apricot at the loser. One man wore those apricots like badges. You notice now that even the quiet patrons have their roles. One man draws lines in spilled coffee and silently plays a solo game of strategy. Another builds tiny towers of sugar cubes and knocks them down with a spoon. It's not idleness, it's ambient thinking, resting out loud. As you stretch again, your opponent across the table gestures at your half-built backgammon disaster and says, "Care for revenge?" You smile, decline, and pass the dice to a new challenger. Because the point really is not to win. The point is to pass the time in a place where time doesn't mind being passed. Our eyes have adjusted fully now. Not just to the dim light of the room, but to its rhythm. The flicker of lanterns, the soft chime of a spoon, the way someone's cough cues someone else's story. You can sense when a joke is about to land or when a cup is ready to be refilled, even if you never hear a word. But things are changing. Slowly, gently. Like the last chapter of a book you don't want to end. You start to notice signs of transition. This particular coffee house, your cozy little empire of cushions and steam, has begun to shift with the world beyond its walls. The men at the front are no longer janissaries. They're shopkeepers now, or clerks, or students wearing trousers that would have raised eyebrows 50 years ago. The shadow puppeteer, once the star of the evening, now performs to smaller crowds. Someone at the corner table is reading a printed newspaper. Yes, a real folded ink-smudged newspaper. Imported from Europe, possibly, or printed locally by one of those newfangled presses that scholars used to joke would make everyone forget how to listen. Because this is the era of transition, the slow, inevitable shift from traditional Ottoman life to something more modern, more Europeanized. And the coffee house, ever the mirror of the times, reflects every step of it. Historians still argue whether the decline of Ottoman coffee houses was due to westernization, government control, or just the creeping pressure of new technologies. Probably all three. As the 18th and 19th centuries rolled in, the state became more nervous than ever about unregulated spaces. Coffee houses were scrutinized, licensed, taxed, occasionally shuttered. Others were quietly rebranded as tea houses, a softer, supposedly more innocent alternative. You walk past one now on your mental map of the city. The smell of green tea replaces the bitter weight of coffee. The cushions are still there, but thinner. The conversation, lighter. There are fewer poets, more accountants. But not all change was loss. Some coffee houses evolved. New spaces opened near universities, attracting younger crowds. Students who debated Enlightenment philosophy and Ottoman reform movements in the same breath. Others sprouted in port cities filled with dock workers and travelers speaking Ladino, Greek, Armenian, Arabic, and sometimes all at once. And there's your fringe tidbit. In the late 1800s, one Istanbul coffee house was known for offering weekly French-language nights, where expatriates and young Ottomans gathered to practice over espresso and sugar cubes. The hosts even tried serving baguettes. They weren't well received. You smile at that. Some rituals resist change, others absorb it. The coffee house did a little of both. You overhear a conversation near the brazier. A young man in a fez is reading aloud from a new novel. Printed, bound, shipped from Cairo. It's full of characters with names like Fatma Hanum and Ali Bey, navigating romantic misunderstandings in long-winded chapters. A group nearby listens politely, if a little sleepily. One mutters, "No poetry, just plot." Another replies, "Maybe that's the point." The old puppeteer hasn't disappeared, though. He's just moved to the back. His shows are shorter now, his metaphors sharper. He's added new characters, a mustachioed government clerk, a sarcastic printing press, a goat with revolutionary leanings. The crowd laughs as softly as ever. You find yourself wondering, will these places still exist in 100 years? 200? Will someone sit in a room like this, sipping from a cup, hearing about the chaos of long-ago reforms, debating what kind of tobacco is too French, or wondering whether the empire ever really ended or just changed its fonts? You look at your own cup, newer, glossier than the old porcelain. There's sugar at the bottom now, a touch of milk. You don't hate it, it's different, not better, not worse, just a new story steeping. And then outside, the call to prayer rings out once again, clearer now, recorded over loudspeakers rather than sung from a minaret. You realize you haven't heard it that way before, not in this script, not in this imagined hour. The past is catching up. Inside, the lamplight flickers, but the brazier is still warm. The cushions have lost some of their shape. The regulars have gray in their beards. And the students, well, they're here too, still scribbling. But now they scribble in notebooks with plastic covers or whisper about Europe with equal parts excitement and unease. One man at the table beside you leans in and says, "You know, they say cafés in Paris have menus." He chuckles like it's both scandal and miracle. What would we even put on ours? You both imagine it. Menu: coffee black, coffee blacker, gossip fresh. poetry by request, political danger medium to high. Someone adds, we'd have to price the backgammon games by emotional damage. You laugh, everyone does. The room is still the room, but just outside the world has grown faster. Ships move with steam, not sails. Letters arrive in hours, not weeks. And the newspaper guy is now muttering about something called a telegraph. The coffeehouse doesn't resist, it absorbs, it adapts. It slows the change just enough to give it meaning. And as the night deepens and the games taper off and someone gently blows out one of the hanging lamps, you feel it settle. Not an ending, but a transformation. The coals have faded to a deep orange glow. Conversations now trail off in murmurs and soft laughter. Someone yawns audibly. A pair of guests nod off against the wall, turbans slipping slightly, heads bobbing like flowers heavy with dew. Even the nargile in the corner gives off the occasional sleepy gurgle instead of its usual bubbling rhythm. You stretch again, slower this time, the movement more instinct than intention. You've been here so long in this Ottoman coffeehouse that exists outside of time. You can barely recall how the night began, only that it started with a cup and a door creaking open. Now, as the evening prepares to fold itself away like an embroidered napkin, the familiar comfort of routine begins again. Cups gathered, lamps dimmed, cushions shaken out just enough for the next evening's guest. The brazier boy sweeps gently around your feet with a soft whisk made of dried palm fronds, careful not to disturb those still lingering. And yet, in this quiet unraveling, you feel the weight of everything that's past. The laughter, the danger, the riddles and rumors, the scholars and storytellers, the scent of clove, the soft scrape of calligraphy on paper. It's all still here, woven into the cushions, absorbed by the plaster, hovering in the air like steam waiting to cool. You think back to that very first cup, the one that burned your fingers slightly as you held it, thick and unfamiliar, grounding and bold. It was just a beverage, maybe. But then again, maybe it was the key to a world. The coffeehouse has given you many things, stories and speculation, riddles and reverence, endless games and glimpses into minds ancient and modern. But above all, it's offered you a mirror, a gently fogged mirror lit by oil lamps in which you can see not only the empire that was, but your own life, reflected in quieter tones. Because haven't you sat like this before? In a cafe on a rainy day, eavesdropping on someone else's conversation? Haven't you argued about nothing with someone who mattered? Shared a seat, a silence, a sip? Modern coffee culture, with its frothy drinks, laptop hunches, and background playlists, isn't as new as we pretend. The Ottoman coffeehouse was doing all that centuries ago, multitasking emotions, whispering protests, updating its feed through puppetry and proverbs. Historians still debate whether this was the first true public sphere, or just a particularly fragrant form of organized leisure. But to you, lying half-curled under a borrowed blanket with one last drop of coffee in your cup, it's clear. The coffeehouse wasn't about revolution or routine, it was about presence. It gave people permission to just be, to wonder out loud, to sit without needing to explain themselves, to pass the time without wasting it. You hear someone humming again, maybe the same tune from hours ago, maybe just a lullaby echoing off the stone. The lights are lower now, most flames snuffed except one still burning gently beside the door. It glows like the memory of everything you've just heard. Someone stacks empty cups. The puppeteer dozes beside his box. A cat stretches, then disappears behind the brazier. Even the gossipers have gone quiet. Your blanket shifts with your breath. It's time. You close your eyes, the scent of cardamom and old smoke curling around you like a final sentence in a long, beautiful paragraph. The Ottoman coffeehouse isn't gone. It's just waiting to be remembered, reimagined, resipped, wind down, 300 words. And now, as the last traces of warmth settle into your limbs and your breath grows slower, softer, let the room fade gently around you. The laughter becomes distant, like echoes in a hallway just beyond sleep. The footsteps of those leaving the coffeehouse grow lighter, more dreamlike, as if walking away not just from a building but from the past itself. The embers in the brazier glow their final orange like tiny suns setting on a miniature world. The cat has found its perch, curled into itself, tail wrapped around a secret only it knows. Even the nargile bubbles no more. Feel the cushion beneath you soften. Imagine the gentle weight of the blanket across your legs, the scent of old books and freshly ground beans lingering at the edge of memory. Let your thoughts drift, like a shadow puppet behind a curtain. No longer sharp, but still moving, still meaningful. There's no need to remember every character, every proverb, every perfectly brewed cup. Just carry the feeling, the calm, the quiet presence of people who knew how to sit, how to listen, how to pass time with reverence and delight. Your breath deepens. The weight of your body grows just a little heavier, safe beneath the warmth of centuries of stories. Let go now. Let the room vanish, the lamplight dim, the voices fade like fog on a warm cup. You're not alone. You're just elsewhere, floating through a space where time sips slowly and nothing is ever truly forgotten. Sleep now. You've been listening. You've been wandering. You've arrived.